Now we're going to continue the same train of thought, this idea of isolating and affecting attack or sustain, but now we're going to do it in a slightly different way. I'm going to introduce the idea of parallel compression. This is something that's going to come up a number of times during this tutorial, but we're going to introduce it right here. The idea behind parallel compression is to create a duplicate of the signal that you want to affect, and you leave the original copy uncompressed. The duplicate copy, you compress it, and then you blend the two together. So basically, you're creating sort of a ratio between a wet and dry version, except instead of something like a reverb, you're doing it with a compression setting. Now, generally, when you're doing parallel compression, and it doesn't have to be this way, but generally, traditionally, parallel compression involves extreme compression. When you're doing extreme compression to something, you create all sorts of artifacts, you create all sorts of weird shape bending, and generally speaking, it's too weird for the main sound, unless you're really trying to go for a special effect. However, if you do that to a copy of the sound and then only blend it in so that 90% of it is the dry sound and 10% of it is the affected sound, the overall effect is actually not so huge. It's actually fairly subtle. And so you can get what you want accomplished in a much more controlled and targeted way and still get something that's fairly transparent. Okay, so let's check it out. Here we have a kick drum. And what I have here is a compressor setup. And what I'm doing is I've got the attack very, very fast as this compressor will go. And I've got the release set just shy of the point where it starts to create something called modulation distortion, where it starts to sort of get funky a little bit because it's releasing too fast. I've got the threshold set pretty low. It's catching a lot of the signal, and it sounds like this. Now, in fairness, in the right context, that could actually sound cool on its own. However, in most cases, it's going to be too far from what the artist is originally intending. It's just going to be too weird. So, let's blend it in with the uncompressed version and see what we get. So that's a subtle example of it. But even with it's almost negative 13 decibels under the dry signal, you still feel a distinct difference. Because I'm isolating so much sustain and body in the parallel chain, bringing it up even significantly lower than the dry sound still adds a good amount of weight. We're going to revisit parallel compression later, especially when we talk about more complex material. But let's move on for now to affecting the very tail tiny part of the sound, the release. The release is a little tricky to affect because it's the quietest part. I find that when you want to target the release of a sound, the best tool you have at your disposal is called an expander. An expander is the opposite of a compressor, basically. While a compressor pulls a signal down after it goes above the threshold, an expander will pull the signal down when it's under the threshold, meaning the quieter signals are going to get even quieter. So let's take a look at an example of that. Let's grab snare drum here, and let's listen to it real quick. Now, aside from that sort of metallic resonance that we talked about before, what's remaining at the very tail of the snare is the room tone. It's subtle, actually. You almost don't even really hear it because it's so quiet, but you'll hear when it's gone. So check this out. Suddenly, the nature of the snare changes in a lot of ways. It becomes much tighter, it becomes more forward sounding because there's less reverb present, it becomes drier sounding because there's less reverb present. And so you can use this tool if you need to do those things. If you need to eliminate the release. Now, most of the time, I don't find myself using an expander for this purpose. However, sometimes, every now and then, it is needed, it is useful, depending on what you're trying to do. Now, let's say you want to do the reverse. Let's say that you want to add release. That's really tricky because at the end of the day, the release is a very, very quiet part of the signal. If you compress even that low, you're still going to get plenty of attack and plenty of sustain. So it's going to be really hard to boost up the release of a signal. But you can do it with an expander, and you can do it with parallel processing. So now the two concepts come together. There is a method to my madness. All right, how you create this is you set the attack to be very long, and you set the threshold very low. So what ends up happening is that any signal that appears is going to cause the expander to let go. But because the attack is so long, the original drum doesn't get a chance to return its attack and sustain. The only thing that ends up getting returned is the release, the very tail end. And I'm going to play that for you now. Okay, it's pretty quiet, so I'm going to turn it up. And that is the ambience around the kick. So now, let's throw that in parallel and see how it sounds. That is the natural reverb that occurred with the kick drum. All right, moving on.